Two R's. The word Deringer, a pocket pistol small enough to hide inside a closed hand, sits in every English dictionary spelled with two R's, a common noun, owned by no one. The man who invented the gun spelled his name with one, Henry Deringer. One R. He never owned the word. He never even owned the second R that made it famous, because his competitors added that letter on purpose, to sell copies of his gun under a name a court could not stop. He was not robbed by a thief. He was robbed by a spelling. He built the most famous handgun in American history, the gun that killed a president inside a locked theater box. And then he watched the newspapers reporting the murder misspell his name into a word that belonged to everyone but him. He sued the man selling the fakes. It turned out to be his own sales agent. He won. Winning changed nothing, because the court's own remedy handed his rivals a legal path to keep the name. He died 3 years later, wealthy and respected, having lost the single thing he made that would outlive him. This is the story of how a gun becomes a word, who took it, and what losing his own name actually cost the man who earned it. Chapter 1. The gunsmith's son who made guns to give away. Henry Deringer was born on the 26th of October, 1786, in Easton, Pennsylvania. His father was a gunsmith. His father's name was also Henry Deringer. That detail matters more than it looks, because the entire story that follows turns on the question of who is allowed to carry a name, and the answer, at the start, was simple. A son inherited it, along with the trade, the tools, and the assumption that a Deringer made guns. He was not an outsider to the business. That is the first thing to understand, and it separates this story from the usual one about a man who wanders in from nowhere and reinvents an industry. Deringer wandered in from the workbench next to his father's. By the time he was old enough to hold a file, he had already spent his childhood inside the sound and smell of the trade. Around 1808, in his early 20s, he was working at the Virginia Manufactory in Richmond, one of the state arsenals producing military arms. He learned the trade the way it was meant to be learned, by making the same lock and the same barrel until the hand stopped thinking about it. Then he went home to Pennsylvania and opened his own shop. The exact year is not settled. Some accounts place it in 1806, some in 1808, and some in 1809, and the records do not fully agree, which is worth noting only because it is the first of several places where the paper trail on this man is thinner than his fame would suggest. What is not in dispute is the neighborhood. He set up in Philadelphia, in a district on the northern edge of the city called Northern Liberties, a working quarter of workshops and tradesmen, and there he stayed for the rest of his life. Now, the decision that defined the first half of his career was not a dramatic one. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was safe. A young gunmaker in the first decades of the 19th century had a choice about who to sell to, and the choices carried very different risks. He could chase the open commercial market, competing on price and reputation against every other smith in a crowded trade. Or he could chase the two largest and most reliable buyers in the country, both of which happened to be the same customer wearing different coats. The first was the United States Army. The second was the United States government acting as a supplier of goods to Native American tribes under the terms of federal treaties. Deringer chose the government, and for roughly the first 30 years of his working life, that is what the Deringer shop was. It was a federal subcontractor. He produced military rifles on the government pattern, the Model 1814 and the Model 1817, the arms the War Department called common rifles because they were meant to be exactly that: common, standardized, interchangeable, unremarkable. By the counts that survive, and these are reported figures rather than audited ones, the shop turned out something on the order of 20,000 of these martial arms over the contract years. That is a large number for a hand trade. It represents years of a shop's entire capacity pointed at a single, unglamorous, repeatable product. The second stream was stranger, and in hindsight it carries an irony the man could not have seen. After the War of 1812, the federal government was obligated by a series of treaties to supply firearms to Native American tribes, and it bought those firearms from private makers. Deringer became one of the makers. By the reported totals, his shop produced somewhere near 50,000 trade rifles over the years, guns manufactured specifically to be handed across a treaty table. Some of that work flowed through John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company, the largest commercial enterprise in the country's early fur trade, which distributed goods, including guns, across the frontier. Sit with the shape of that for a moment. The man whose name would one day mean a weapon of murder spent the productive prime of his life making guns that were given away as instruments of policy. They were not sold to the men who used them. They were handed over as terms. His product, in those years, was not a thing a customer wanted and chose. It was a thing a government owed and delivered. He was as far from the retail counter as a gunmaker could get, and he was doing well there. Steady contracts, predictable volume, a reputation, inside the trade, as a serious and capable maker of ordinary arms. The structure of that work is worth naming precisely because it is the exact opposite of the structure that would later make him famous, and the contrast is the whole point. A government contract is a wholesale relationship. There is one buyer, or a handful, buying in bulk, on specification, at a negotiated price, on a schedule. The maker competes for the contract once, up front, on terms and capacity and price, and then the buyer is captive to the deal for its duration. It is a stable, unglamorous, low-drama way to run a shop. It is also completely invisible to the public, because the public is never the customer. Nobody in the country knew Deringer's name from a model 1817, and nobody was supposed to. The name on that barrel was a matter of federal procurement records, not desire. And the treaty rifles carried an anonymity even deeper than the muskets. Those 50,000 or so trade guns were, by their entire purpose, meant to disappear into a distribution system, moving from Deringer's shop to the government, to the fur companies, to the treaty tables, to the tribes, changing hands 3 or 4 times before they reached a person who would actually carry one. No link in that chain chose a Deringer. Each link accepted whatever the contract specified. It is difficult to design a business more perfectly guaranteed to produce volume without producing fame. And for the better part of 3 decades, that is exactly what the shop produced. That was not a name, it was a living. There is a business lesson buried in these first 30 years, and it is not the flattering one. Government contracts build a shop. They fill an order book, they pay a payroll, they justify a building. What they do not build is a name that means anything to the public, because the public never sees the product, never chooses it, never asks for it by the maker. The soldier issued a model 1817 did not select a Deringer. He was handed the arm the quartermaster had. The name on the barrel was a matter of procurement, not desire. And a name that no customer ever asks for is a name that has no market value, no matter how many barrels carry it. Deringer had spent 3 decades building volume. He had built almost no brand. He could not have known how much that would matter, because the thing that would make it matter had not happened yet, and the buyer, who was steady enough to build a shop around, was about to disappear. By the middle of the 1840s, Deringer had stopped pursuing the government work that had carried him. The martial contracts thinned. The treaty arrangements shifted. The particular corner of the trade he had occupied for a generation was closing, and a man in his late 50s, comfortable, established, respected inside the trade and unknown outside it, faced the decision that most established men in that position never make. He decided to start over. Chapter 2. The Pivot at 50. Reinvention is a young person's word. It suggests someone with nothing to lose and everything ahead. Henry Deringer was neither. By the mid-1840s, he was a man past 50 who had spent his entire adult life mastering one kind of work, and that work was drying up underneath him. The safe choice, the human choice, would have been to ride the existing shop down slowly, taking what smaller commercial and sporting orders came, coasting on a good local reputation into a comfortable old age. Plenty of makers did exactly that. History does not record their names, which is the point. Deringer made a different decision, and it is the decision the entire rest of the story rests on. He turned away from the market he had served for 30 years, the market of governments and armies and bulk contracts, and he pointed his shop at a single, small civilian object that almost nobody was making well. A pocket pistol. Not a military sidearm. Not a dueling piece, though he had made fine ones. A gun designed from the first principle to be carried hidden on an ordinary person in an ordinary coat in the course of ordinary life. The idea was not new to him. He had been experimenting with small, large-caliber, short-barreled pistols since around 1825, tinkering at the edges of the concept for 2 decades while the contract work paid the bills. What changed in the 1840s was not the invention, it was the commitment. The tinkering became the business. And by roughly 1852, the object had matured into the form that would carry his name into the language, a true percussion cap pocket pistol in what would become steady production. To understand why this was a genuine gamble and not an obvious pivot, it helps to understand what the object actually was, because at first glance, it looks like a step down. A military rifle is a serious instrument. It is long, powerful, accurate at distance, a tool of consequence. The thing Deringer chose to stake his late career on was, by contrast, almost a toy in the hand. It fired a single shot, one. Then it was an empty club until it was reloaded, and reloading a muzzle-loading percussion pistol was not a matter of seconds. In a world already beginning to dream about repeating arms, about guns that could fire round after round without pause, Deringer bet his shop on a gun that could fire exactly once. That was not a step backward. It was a bet that most people, most of the time, did not need a gun that fired many times. They needed a gun that fired once, reliably, at very close range, and that they could carry so easily they would actually have it on them when the once arrived. To feel the size of that bet, set it against what the rest of the gun trade was chasing in the same years. The great commercial energy of the American firearms industry in the 1840s and 1850s was pointed at the opposite of what Deringer was building. It was pointed at repetition. Samuel Colt had patented his revolving pistol in the 1830s and, after an early failure, was building it into one of the most famous manufacturing operations in the country, a business whose entire premise was that a man should be able to fire 5 or 6 shots without reloading. The future of the handgun, everyone could see, was more shots, faster, from a single loading. That was where the investment went. The patents, the factories, the excitement. Deringer looked at that consensus and bet the other way. And he did it not out of ignorance, but out of a clear read of a different customer. He was not trying to win the gunfight the revolver was designed for, the running, multi-shot affair of the frontier and the battlefield. He was arming a quieter and more common moment, the sudden, ugly, arm's-length instant in a saloon or a coach or a dark street, where the whole event was over in a second or two and the only question that mattered was whether a man was already holding something. For that moment, capacity was almost irrelevant and concealment was everything. A revolver left at home because it was too bulky to carry was worth nothing in that instant. A single-shot Deringer riding in a man's vest was worth his life. He was not competing with Colt. He was competing with the decision to go unarmed. The technology that made the bet possible was the percussion cap. The distinction is worth a sentence of plumbing, because without it, the whole product is impossible. An older flintlock pistol ignited its charge with a shower of sparks from flint-striking steel, a system that needed a pan of loose priming powder and a fair amount of mechanism, and that was unreliable when jostled, damp, or crammed into a pocket. The percussion cap replaced all of that with a small metal cap of shock-sensitive compound that sat on a nipple over the charge and fired when the hammer struck it. It was more reliable. It was more compact. And crucially, it worked when the gun had been riding in a coat pocket all day, which a flintlock, with its loose priming powder, largely did not. Percussion ignition is what made a genuinely pocketable pistol practical rather than theoretical. It is the enabling technology, the same way a particular cartridge or a particular action enables the guns that come later. Deringer did not invent the percussion cap. What he did was recognize, earlier and more completely than most, that this one piece of chemistry had quietly made an entire category of product possible. A category that had not really existed before because the older ignition could not support it. A gun a man could forget he was carrying. The specifications tell the story of the priorities. The barrels were short, most commonly in the range of 2 to 2.5 inches, though surviving examples run from barely over an inch to more than 4. The caliber was large for the size, most typically around 41, with examples ranging from roughly 31 up to 50. Hold those two numbers together, because their combination is the whole engineering thesis. A very short barrel and a very large bore. That is a gun that makes no sense at distance and total sense across a card table. It was never meant to reach. It was meant to end something at the length of an arm. The bore was rifled, the stock was walnut, and the metal furniture was a copper-nickel alloy the period called German silver, which gave the little guns their pale, expensive shine without the cost of actual silver. Inside the breech, genuine examples carried a distinctive detail, a set of notches, commonly counted at 7, cut at the inside front of the barrel. That detail was not decoration. It was closer to a fingerprint, a maker's tell, the kind of quiet internal signature that lets an expert tell a real one from a copy. Remember the notches. The question of how to tell a real Deringer from a fake one is going to become the most expensive question of his life. Everything about the object was an argument for carrying a gun that most days would never be fired, small enough to vanish, powerful enough to matter, reliable enough to trust, and made to a standard of finish that told the buyer he was holding something better than the competition, because the finish was going to have to do a job that Deringer did not yet understand he was asking of it. The finish was going to have to be the trademark, in a country that barely had trademarks. He had built the product. He had not yet found out who would buy it, and the answer, when it came, was not the answer he had built it for. Chapter 3. A gun that fires once. The engineering problem Deringer solved was a problem of contradiction. Everything that makes a gun easy to carry makes it worse to shoot, and everything that makes a gun effective makes it harder to hide. A long barrel is accurate and powerful and impossible to conceal. A large caliber hits hard and adds weight and bulk. A serious mechanism is reliable and takes up space. The entire history of the concealable handgun is the history of people trying to cheat that trade-off, and most of them cheated it by giving something up, usually power. They made small guns that were small in every sense, easy to carry and barely worth carrying, because the round they fired would not reliably stop a determined man. Deringer refused to give up the power. That is the specific decision at the center of the product, and it is a decision about what the gun was for. He kept the caliber large, around 41 in the typical gun, a serious ball, and he paid for that decision everywhere else. He paid for it in range, cutting the barrel down to a couple of inches, which meant the gun was wildly inaccurate at any real distance and did not care. He paid for it in capacity, accepting a single shot rather than trying to build a repeating mechanism into so small a frame. He paid for it in reload speed, accepting that a muzzle-loading pocket pistol, once fired, was effectively finished for the encounter. What he bought with all that spending was a gun that put a large ball into a target at close range from an object that disappeared into a waistcoat. The whole design is an answer to a single question, and the question was not how to win a gunfight. The question was how to survive the first 2 seconds of a robbery, a card dispute, or an ambush at a range measured in feet. For that question, one large ball from a gun that is actually in the pocket beats 6 small ones from a gun left at home. That gap, between the gun a man owns and the gun a man carries on his body, was the product. Deringer built for the gun on the body. The finish work served the same logic from a different direction. These were not crude guns. The walnut stocks were often inlaid, the German silver furniture was shaped and polished, the better examples were engraved, and the whole object had a jewel-like quality in the hand that was entirely deliberate. A pocket pistol is a personal object in a way a military rifle is not. It rides against the body. It comes out in private. It is chosen by the person who carries it rather than issued to them. Deringer understood that he was no longer making tools for a quartermaster. He was making possessions for individuals, and individuals pay for beauty. And beauty was also, though he may not have framed it this way, a defense against copying. A finely finished gun is harder to counterfeit convincingly than a crude one. The quality was a moat. The problem, which the story will come to, is that a moat made of craftsmanship only works if the customer can tell the difference, and the customer, holding a good enough copy at a lower price, very often could not. The sizes show that the market was human and specific. Some of these guns were made small enough, and the barrels short enough, that they could be carried by a woman inside a hand warmer, the padded fur muff that was a common winter accessory of the period. The type became common enough to earn its own name. They were called muff pistols. Consider the actual use case that phrase describes. A person moving through a public place, hands tucked out of the cold, and inside the fur, unseen, a large caliber pistol resting in the palm, already in the hand, already pointed, needing only to be fired. That is not a dueling weapon, and it is not a soldier's weapon. It is a weapon for people who expected trouble to arrive suddenly, at conversational distance, and who intended to be holding the answer before the trouble knew the answer existed. It is worth drawing the contrast with the other small, fine pistols a shop like Deringer's could make, because the contrast shows how deliberately he had chosen his target. A dueling pistol was also a beautiful, expensive, single-shot, large-caliber handgun. But a dueling pistol was a long-barreled instrument of ritual, drawn openly, aimed carefully across a measured distance, in a formal contest with rules and seconds and a code. It was made to be seen. The Deringer pocket pistol inverted every one of those qualities except the caliber and the craftsmanship. It was made not to be seen, drawn not by ritual but by ambush, aimed not across a field but at the length of a handshake, in a contest with no rules at all. Same quality of object, opposite philosophy of use. The dueling pistol was for the fight a man agreed to have. The Deringer was for the fight that came at him without warning. That difference is the entire reason the caliber had to stay large in so small a gun. At the range, a Deringer was actually used. A range measured in feet and sometimes in inches. There was no time for a second shot and no room to miss. And a small, underpowered ball that failed to stop a man instantly was not a defense at all. The design accepted that it would get exactly one chance and built everything around, making that one chance count. A large ball, close, now. Everything else, range, accuracy, capacity, was spent to buy that. That was the gun. A single, serious shot, hidden, finished like a piece of jewelry, priced like a luxury, and built for a customer Deringer had defined with real precision. Travelers. Gamblers, city dwellers, women, people whose lives put them within arm's reach of strangers and who wanted, quietly, to be armed. What Deringer had actually invented, underneath the specific object, was a category of behavior that had barely existed before and would define an entire future of the gun trade. He had made the everyday carrying of a hidden, powerful handgun by an ordinary civilian into something practical. Before the concealable percussion pocket pistol, a person who wanted to be armed in daily life had bad options, weapons too large to hide or too weak to matter. Deringer collapsed that trade-off, and in doing so he became, without any grand announcement, the forefather of concealed carry as a mass civilian practice. The little gun in the coat pocket, the equalizer that lets a smaller or weaker or simply cautious person hold a decisive answer to sudden violence, begins in a recognizable modern form with him. That is a large thing to have originated. It is also, again, a thing he did not own, because no one can own a category of behavior any more than a word can be owned, And both of the things Deringer truly created, the concealed carry pistol and the name for it, were destined to belong to everyone but him. He had built exactly the right gun for that customer. What he had not done was figure out where that customer actually was. And when the answer arrived, it arrived from 2,000 miles away, from a place that barely existed when he started, and it arrived in a volume his handmade shop could not begin to satisfy. The demand was about to find him. He had not gone looking for it, and because he had not gone looking for it, he had also not built any way to control it. Chapter 4. The Buyers He Never Courted. In January of 1848, a carpenter found gold in the tail race of a sawmill on the American River in California. Within 2 years, 100,000 people had moved toward it. This is the event that made Henry Deringer, and he had nothing to do with causing it, which is precisely the problem that will define his last decade. Consider what the California gold rush actually was, from the narrow angle of a pocket pistol maker in Philadelphia. It was a sudden, enormous concentration of men, most of them young, most of them armed, most of them strangers to one another, in a territory with almost no established law, all of them carrying, or hoping to carry, sudden wealth in a form that could be taken off a body in seconds. Gold dust, coin, nuggets in a pouch. A society could hardly be engineered more perfectly to want a concealable, powerful, personal weapon. The demand for exactly the product Deringer had spent the 1840s perfecting did not have to be created. It created itself, overnight, 2,000 miles from his workshop. And it came to his door without being asked. The historian J.E. Parsons, who studied these pistols closely, left a line that compresses the whole situation into 4 words. Deringer, he wrote, did not have to advertise. Sit with that as a business fact, because it is a stranger fact than it sounds. Here was a man whose product was in such demand that the ordinary machinery of selling, the pitching, the promoting, the persuading, was simply unnecessary. The name traveled ahead of the salesman. A person arriving in San Francisco who wanted a pocket pistol did not need to be told what to want. They asked for a Deringer, by name, the way a later generation would ask for a brand without knowing it was a brand. That is the summit of a certain kind of business success. The maker's name has become the name of the thing. The customer does not want a pocket pistol. The customer wants a Deringer and considers the two to be the same. Most makers spend their whole lives trying to reach that summit and never do. Deringer reached it, in the American West, sometime in the 1850s, and reaching it was the beginning of the disaster, because a name that has become the name of the thing is a name that is about to stop belonging to the man who made it. The reason is almost mathematical. When customers ask for a maker's product by name, and cannot easily tell that product from a copy, and stand 2,000 miles from the maker and from any court that might protect him, then the name has become the single most valuable and least defended asset in the entire transaction. The name is doing all the selling, and the name is stamped on a barrel, in letters, where anyone with a set of dies can put the same letters on his own barrel. Deringer had built a reputation that sold guns, sight unseen, on the strength of the word alone, and he had built it in the one place on earth where he was least able to police who else used the word. The pricing shows these were not cheap objects, which sharpened every incentive to fake them. A Deringer pistol ran, by the reported figures, somewhere around $15 for a plain model and up to $25 for an engraved and silver-mounted pair, because the guns were commonly sold in matched pairs, one for each pocket. Translate the intent rather than the exact sum. This was a meaningful amount of money, the price of a serious personal possession, not an impulse. A copy that could be sold for less, under the same magic name, to a customer who could not inspect the 7 notches inside the breech, was almost free money for anyone willing to make it. The higher Deringer's reputation drove the price, the larger the reward for stealing the reputation. The geography of the demand made the problem worse in a way that is easy to miss. California was the peak of it, but the appetite ran along the whole spine of the country's rougher commerce, down the Mississippi trade to New Orleans, through the river gambling boats, across the mining camps and boom towns of the West, everywhere that men carried money among strangers in places where the law was thin or absent. This was a national, dispersed, frontier market, and it was precisely the kind of market a hand shop in Philadelphia was least equipped to serve or to police. Deringer could not see his customers. He could not see who was selling to them. He could only make guns, slowly, by hand, and ship them toward a demand that always ran ahead of his ability to fill it. And that gap between demand and supply was not a temporary problem that scale would solve, because Deringer had chosen not to scale in the way that might have closed it. He remained, by the accounts, one of the last American gunmakers to work largely by hand, producing his thousands of pairs of pistols through skilled craft rather than through the interchangeable parts, machine-driven mass production that men like Colt were building into enormous factories in the same decades. That choice preserved the quality that was supposed to be his moat. It also permanently capped his output, and every gun he could not make was a gun a faster, cruder, cheaper competitor would make in his name. Across the whole run of years, the genuine Philadelphia shop is thought to have produced something in the neighborhood of 15,000 pistols. That is a reported figure, and it should be held loosely, but its scale is the point. 15,000 guns, made by hand, over a couple of decades, by a shop that could not keep pace with the frontier's appetite. The demand outran the supply, and every gap between what people wanted and what Deringer could make by hand was a space that someone else was going to fill. They would fill it with copies, and they would sell those copies under his name, because his name was the only part of the product that mattered, and the only part they could reproduce perfectly. Deringer had one thing standing between his business and that flood. It was not a patent, because he did not have one. It was not a registered trademark, because in the America of the 1850s, that concept barely functioned. It was two words stamped into steel: his name and his city. Chapter 5. The name on the barrel. The barrel of a genuine Deringer carried a stamp. It read, in the abbreviated style of the period, P. Deringer Philadella. The P stood not for a first name, but for the maker's mark convention of the trade, and the abbreviation stood for Philadelphia. 2 words and a place. That stamp was the most important thing the company owned, and it is worth stating plainly why. Because the modern mind takes the answer for granted, and the answer is the hinge of the whole tragedy. The stamp was the product's identity. In an age before packaging, before advertising in its modern form, before any of the elaborate machinery a modern company uses to say this one is mine and that one is a fake, the name struck into the metal was the entire apparatus of trust. A customer who could not personally judge the quality of a lock or the trueness of a bore could still read a name, and the name carried everything the customer knew, or had heard, about what a Deringer was worth. The stamp was not a label on the product. The stamp, functionally, was the product. People were paying for the word. Now, here is the decision that sits at the exact center of this man's business life, and it is a decision made mostly by omission, which is why it is easy to miss and impossible to overstate. Henry Deringer never patented the pistol. He never secured a trademark on the name. He protected the most valuable asset he owned with nothing but the 2 words stamped on the steel and the reputation behind them. It is tempting to call that a mistake, and by its result it was a catastrophic one, but it deserves to be understood as a decision with reasons rather than a simple failure of foresight, because the reasons are what make it tragic instead of merely foolish. Consider the world he was deciding in. American patent law existed, but a patent required disclosing the design in public detail, teaching every competitor exactly how the thing was built, in exchange for a protection that was expensive and slow to enforce. And there was little in the Deringer pistol that was mechanically novel enough to patent in the first place. It was a percussion pocket pistol. The percussion cap was not his. The pocket pistol was not his. What was his was the specific execution and, above all, the reputation. And reputation is precisely the thing a patent does not protect. Trademark protection, the thing that actually would have mattered, barely existed as a working legal instrument in the United States at mid-century. There was no federal trademark registry a man could file with. The whole body of law that a modern company relies on to own its name was, in the 1850s, embryonic, uncertain, and largely untested. Deringer could not go to an office and register P. Deringer Philadella as his property, because no such office meaningfully existed for him to go to. The federal government would not pass a workable trademark statute until years after his death, and the whole modern apparatus of registered marks and brand ownership that a business now takes for granted was, in his working life, not weak, but essentially absent. He was operating in the last era before a name could be legally owned as property, and he did not know it, because no one did. Understand what a maker's mark had always meant, historically, to grasp how exposed that left him. For centuries, a craftsman's mark, the stamp a smith or a silversmith or a gunmaker struck into his work, had functioned on trust and reputation, and the informal policing of guilds and neighbors, not on statute. In a world where a maker sold locally, to people who knew him, that was enough. A fraudulent mark was caught, because the community was small and the maker was known. Deringer had inherited that centuries-old system of trust, and it had worked for him for decades in a local trade. What broke it was not that the system got worse. What broke it was that his market got enormous and anonymous and national, while the system of protection stayed medieval. He was defending a nationwide brand with a village's tools. So his reasoning, reconstructed, was not stupid. It was this: the design is not patentable in any way that helps. The law offers no clean way to register the name. My defense, therefore, is quality and reputation. My guns are better than the copies. Buyers will learn to prefer the real thing, and the 7 notches inside the breech and the fineness of the work will separate my product from the imitations. He bet, in other words, that being good was protection enough. He bet that the market would police the counterfeiters for him by preferring his craftsmanship. That was not an unreasonable bet in a local market where a buyer could hold two guns side by side and a maker's neighbors knew his work. It was a fatal bet in a national market, at a distance, where the buyer held one gun, could not compare it to anything, and simply trusted the name on the barrel. And the name on the barrel was the one thing about the entire product that any competent shop in the country could reproduce exactly. The reframe is unavoidable, and it is the thesis of the whole story, stated early so that everything after it lands. Deringer thought his product was the pistol. His product was the name. The pistol, others could copy. The name, in a functioning legal system, only he could own. But he had not secured the name, and the legal system was not yet functioning, and so the single most valuable thing his shop produced sat on the open barrel of every gun he sold, unprotected, waiting for anyone with a set of letter dies and fewer scruples to lift it clean off the steel. They did not wait long, and the first of them did not come from some distant rival shop he had never met. The first of them came from inside his own building, men who had learned the trade at his bench, who knew exactly where the 7 notches went, and who understood better than anyone alive that the valuable part was never the gun. Chapter 6. 7 notches and a second R. The counterfeiting of the Deringer pistol was not a nuisance at the margins of the business. It became, in time, larger in volume than the genuine article, and it was carried out with a thoroughness that shows the counterfeiters understood the product better than any honest description of it would. They did not merely copy the gun, they copied the marks. Start with the marks, because the marks are where the theft actually happened. A forger reproducing a Deringer had 2 jobs. Make something that looked and worked enough like the real thing to pass, which was not especially hard, and stamp it with the identity that made it valuable, which was trivially easy. So they stamped it. They cut dies that reproduced the P. Deringer Philadelphia mark, or something close enough to it to fool a buyer who had never seen an authentic one. Some even reproduced the internal tells, the proof marks, and the details near the breech that were supposed to certify a gun as genuine. The 7 notches, the quiet fingerprint Deringer used to know his own work, could be imitated by anyone who took the trouble to look. The signature that was meant to prove authenticity became just one more thing to forge. And then there was the spelling, which is where this chapter earns its title, and where the whole story turns on a single letter. The counterfeiters, and there were many of them, did not all reproduce the name exactly. Some misspelled it, sometimes out of carelessness, and sometimes out of a shrewd instinct for self-protection. Surviving fakes carry variants. Deringer with an extra E, Deringer with a U, and, most consequentially, Deringer with a second R. That second R was not an accident. Or rather, however it started, it became something other than an accident, because it did a job. A gun-stamped Deringer, with 1 R, was a direct forgery of a specific man's specific name, the kind of thing that even the weak law of the period might eventually be persuaded to punish. A gun-stamped Deringer, with 2 R's, was, a clever forger could argue, not that man's name at all. It was a different word. It was close enough to trade on all the value of the real name, and just far enough to muddy the question of whether any single man's property had been stolen. The extra letter was a legal hedge disguised as a typo. Hold on to that letter. Everything the rest of this story does with the word Deringer, every place that spelling appears, from a courtroom to a newspaper to a dictionary, descends from that small, deliberate act of adding an R to skirt a name. The version of Henry Deringer's name that conquered the English language was the version his counterfeiters invented specifically so they could steal from him without technically using his name. The word that made him immortal is the forgery. Deringer was not passive about this. It is important to say that clearly, because the shape of the story can make him sound like a man who simply let it happen, and he did not. He fought it for most of his working life. He understood that the counterfeits were bleeding both his sales and, worse, his reputation. Because a buyer sold a shoddy fake under his name did not blame the forger he had never heard of. He blamed Deringer. Every bad copy in a stranger's pocket was a small subtraction from the exact asset the whole business ran on. So he hunted them. By the reported accounts, he employed agents in New York, one of the great distribution points, to search out counterfeit Deringers in the trade, and he offered rewards, figures of around $100, for evidence that could identify and pin down the forgers. Put that in proportion. $100, at a time when the genuine pistol itself sold for $15, was a serious bounty, 4 to 6 guns worth of money offered for a single piece of evidence. It measures how much the counterfeiting hurt, and how hard it was to catch, that a careful businessman would pay that much for a lead. The damage the counterfeits did was not only the sale each one stole. That was the visible loss, and it was the smaller one. The deeper loss was to the reputation itself, the very asset the whole business ran on, and it ran in a direction Deringer could not stop. Picture the buyer who paid good money for what he believed was a genuine Deringer, carried it, and found it wanting. A softer lock, a rougher bore, a gun that did not perform the way the name had promised. That buyer did not know the name of the forger who made it. He had never heard of Slaughter or of any of them. The only name he knew was the one stamped on the barrel, the one the whole scheme depended on, and that name was Deringer. So the disappointment attached itself to Deringer. Every bad copy in circulation was quietly teaching some fraction of the market that a Deringer was not as good as its reputation, which corroded the reputation, which was the entire product. The counterfeiters were not just stealing his sales. They were spending down his name and charging the cost of every failure to him. But bounties and agents are a way of fighting a symptom. They chase individual fakes through the channels of the trade, one at a time, after the fact. And they can no more stop the flood than a man with a bucket can stop a tide, because the underlying condition, the thing that made the counterfeiting inevitable, had never been fixed. The name was unprotected. As long as the name was unprotected and the name was the value, forgery was not a crime the market punished. It was a business opportunity the market rewarded. And the people best positioned to seize that opportunity were not distant strangers. They were the men who had stood at Deringer's own benches, learned his own methods, and walked out the door carrying the one piece of knowledge that mattered, which was not how to make the gun. It was how little the gun had ever mattered next to the name on it. They were about to prove it. One of them, a former Deringer hand, was about to open a shop of his own, and the guns that shop produced would be so close to the genuine article that the difference stopped being a matter of quality and became only a matter of the words stamped on the steel. And the man who would sell those copies across the entire Western market was not a stranger to Deringer at all. He was Deringer's own agent. Chapter 7. The Men Who Left. The most dangerous competitor a craftsman can have is the man he trained. This is true in almost every trade, but it is especially true in a trade where the valuable asset is not a machine or a patent, but a method and a name, both of which walk out the door inside a person's head. Deringer discovered this the way most masters discover it, slowly and then all at once. The names that matter here belong to a family called Schlotterbeck. Charles and Frederick Schlotterbeck were men who had worked in and around the Deringer operation, who had learned the making of these pistols from the inside, and who reached a conclusion that former employees have always reached about successful shops. They decided the market was bigger than the master was serving, and that they were as capable of serving it as he was. They were not wrong about either point. That is what made them dangerous. Around 1860, Frederick Schlotterbeck opened a shop under a shortened, Americanized version of the family name. He called it Slaughter & Company. And Slaughter & Company did not make pocket pistols that competed with Deringers by being different. It made pocket pistols that competed by being the same. Near identical copies, in form, in size, in the general look and feel of the genuine article, produced by men who knew precisely how the real ones were built because they had built real ones. The gap in quality that Deringer had been counting on, the moat of craftsmanship that was supposed to let buyers tell the true from the false, was exactly the gap these men were equipped to close. They had his craftsmanship. They had learned it from him. The dynamic is an old one, and Deringer had no defense against it, because the defense would have required him to do the one thing his whole method refused. The value in his shop lived in two places. It lived in the name, which he had not secured, and it lived in the method, the hand skill of building these particular pistols to this particular standard, which existed nowhere but in the hands and heads of the men who did the work. A business whose crucial knowledge is craft knowledge, carried in people, is a business whose crucial knowledge walks home every night and can walk away for good any morning. There was no patent wrapping the method, because he had patented nothing. There was no way to stop a trained man from setting up across town and doing exactly what he had been taught to do. Every apprentice Deringer trained to protect his quality was also, the day the training took, a fully equipped competitor waiting to happen. The better he taught, the more dangerous the graduate. What they did not have was his name, and here the story splits into the two roads that counterfeiters traveled. The cruder forgers simply stamped Deringer's name, or a misspelling of it, straight onto their guns and sold the lie directly. The Slaughter operation, and others like it, played a subtler and more durable game. They built guns close enough to the Deringer pattern that the market read them as Deringers, marked in ways that traded on the association, and they let the customer's own eagerness do the rest. A buyer who wanted a Deringer, handed a Slaughter that looked like one, at a better price, was often happy not to ask hard questions. Consider the position this put Deringer in, because it is the position that finally forced him into court. He was an aging man running a hand shop. His competitors included men who had trained under him, who could match his work, who were multiplying, and who were selling into a national market he had no way to police. His volume, that reported 15,000 or so pistols across the whole life of the genuine shop, was a fixed thing, limited by the pace of hand manufacture. Their volume was limited only by demand. Because they could and did cut corners, he would not, and price lower than he could. The genuine article was being surrounded, outnumbered, and undersold by its own reflection. And the reflection was reaching the customer through channels Deringer himself had built. This is the detail that turns a story about counterfeiting into a story about betrayal, and it is the point where a name to remember enters the record. To sell his pistols into the California market, the market that had made him, Deringer relied on agents, distributors on the ground who moved his guns to the buyers he could not reach from Philadelphia. One of the most important of those agents, in San Francisco, the beating heart of the Western trade, was a man named Adolph J. Plate. Plate was not, at the start, a villain in this story. He was the opposite. He was infrastructure. He was the trusted local partner, the authorized agent, the man whose entire commercial value depended on being the reliable source of the genuine Deringer in the West. The relationship was exactly the kind a maker 2,000 miles from his market needs and cannot easily replace. Deringer made the guns. Plate sold them. It worked, until the moment Plate realized that the customers walking into his San Francisco establishment did not actually care whether the gun was genuine. They cared whether it said Deringer, near enough, at a good price. Once an agent understands that, the temptation is enormous, and the math is brutal. Plate could keep selling the genuine article, made slowly and expensively by an old man in Philadelphia, at the margin an honest agent earns. Or he could sell copies, made faster and cheaper by the men who had left Deringer's shop, stamped or styled to satisfy a buyer who wanted the name more than the truth, at a margin that was his to widen. The distribution channel that Deringer had built to protect and extend his market was about to be turned into the primary weapon against it. The man he trusted to sell his guns was about to become the man selling the fakes. Chapter 8. The Agent in San Francisco. Adolph Plate did the thing the incentives were pushing him toward. He began distributing the copies. By the reported accounts, the volume was not small and it was not occasional. Plate moved slaughter-made pistols and their like through his San Francisco operation at a rate reported at more than 400 units a month, sold at prices below the genuine article, into the exact market that Deringer's own reputation had built and that Plate had been trusted to serve. 400 a month. Set that number against the genuine shop's lifetime output of roughly 15,000 pistols and the arithmetic becomes almost unbearable. The copies flowing through a single agent in a single city were running at a pace that, sustained, would rival or exceed the entire handmade production of the original in a fraction of the time. Deringer was being outproduced in his own name, through his own distribution, by the men who had trained under him, sold by the man he had trusted. The whole architecture of his business had been quietly reversed and pointed back at him. The betrayal had a particular shape that made it worse than ordinary counterfeiting, and the shape is about control. When a stranger forges a maker's product, he is an external enemy, one a maker can, at least in principle, fight from outside. When a maker's own distributor sells the fakes, the enemy is inside the one relationship he depends on to reach his market at all. Deringer could not simply cut Plate off and route around him because Plate was the route. To reach California, the market that mattered most, Deringer needed agents on the ground. And agents on the ground were, by their nature, people he could not watch, operating 2,000 miles away, whose loyalty he had to take on trust because he had no other option. He had built his access to his most important market on a relationship he could not supervise, and the person on the other end of it had discovered that the fakes paid better than the originals. Distribution, it turned out, was not something Deringer owned. It was something he rented, from people whose interests could turn against his the moment the math changed. And the math had changed. For a man who had spent his working life avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation, who had built a career on steady contracts and quiet reputation rather than legal warfare, the decision to sue was not a small one. But there was, finally, no other move. The bounties had not stopped it. The agents hunting fakes in New York had not stopped it. The mote of craftsmanship had failed, because the copies were good enough and the buyers were undiscriminating enough that quality no longer separated the true from the false in the customer's hand. The only asset left to defend was the name, and the only place left to defend it was a courtroom, in the state where the theft was worst. So, around 1863, Henry Deringer sued Adolph Plate in California. He sued the agent, not the maker, and the choice is revealing. Plate was the point where the counterfeit met the customer, the visible, reachable, San Francisco end of the whole operation, the man whose sales could be documented and whose betrayal was most direct. Deringer's claim was for damages, and the figure he sought was $15,000. Hold that number next to the $15 price of a single pistol. He was asking the court for the value of 1,000 guns, a sum meant to capture not just the sales he had lost, but the injury to the thing the sales rode on, his name. The lawsuit itself measures how far the situation had deteriorated, because it represented a complete reversal of the man's lifelong strategy. Deringer had spent 60 years avoiding exactly this. His whole career had been built on staying out of court, on letting quality and reputation do the work that other men did through contracts and litigation and aggression. He had not patented, had not registered, had not fought his rivals through the law but through the quiet superiority of his product. Now, an old man in his mid-70s, he was doing the one thing his entire method had been designed to make unnecessary. He was in a California courtroom, 2,000 miles from his shop, suing his own agent, because the strategy of being better than the competition had finally and completely failed against competitors who were good enough and a market that could not tell the difference. The lawsuit was not a strategy. It was the admission that the strategy was gone. The case that resulted, Deringer against Plate, would become something its aging plaintiff almost certainly did not set out to create. It would become one of the early landmarks in the whole developing body of American trademark law. A case that courts and scholars would look back on as one of the places where the idea that a man could own his commercial name and be compensated when it was stolen was worked out in practice rather than theory. Deringer, who had never registered a trademark because there was scarcely a way to, was about to help establish in a courtroom the very principle whose absence had ruined him. There is a bitter symmetry in that, and it deserves to be named rather than rushed past. The reason the counterfeiting had been possible in the first place was that the law offered a maker almost no way to secure his name in advance. Deringer's response, forced on him by that gap, was to go to court after the fact and ask a judge to protect the name anyway. And in doing so, he became part of how the law came to recognize such protection at all. He was helping to build, out of his own losses, the fence that might have saved him if it had existed 30 years earlier. The fence went up around his ruin. The specific legal idea the case helped advance is worth stating plainly, because it is the thing Deringer needed and never had. The principle was that a maker's name, used in trade, is a form of property, and that a competitor who uses that name to pass off his own goods commits a wrong the courts will remedy, whether or not any formal registration exists. That is the seed of modern trademark protection, and in the middle of the 19th century, American courts were only beginning to articulate it, case by case, out of older doctrines about fraud and deceit. Deringer against Plate sits among the early American decisions where that seed was being worked out in practice, which is why it is remembered by people who have never held a pistol. Deringer, who could not register a mark because there was no registry, became, against his will and at his own expense, a small part of the legal history that built the registry for everyone who came after. But being a footnote in the development of the law is not the same as being protected by it, and the timing of the two things is the whole cruelty. The protection matured too late for the man who helped mature it. Courts would go on refining the doctrine for decades, and a federal trademark system would eventually exist, and future makers would be able to do in an afternoon at a government office what Deringer could not do in a lifetime of lawsuits. He got the litigation and the legacy. Someone else, later, would get the security. But a landmark in legal history is one thing. A remedy for the man is another, and they are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the cruelest turn in the entire story. Deringer was about to win his case. The court was going to find in his favor, was going to agree that his name had been wronged, was going to order Plate to stop, and the victory was going to be worth almost nothing, because of what the court awarded, and worse, because of the loophole the whole affair left standing, a loophole that would let his rivals keep the name legally, forever, by exploiting the one thing Deringer's lawsuit could never fix. Chapter 9. The verdict that freed them. The court found for Deringer. That has to be said first and plainly, because the headline of the case is that he won. The California court agreed that Plate had wronged him, agreed in substance that the name and the reputation attached to it were a thing of value that had been improperly taken, and ruled against the agent. On the question of principle, the old man was vindicated. His name was his. The law said so. Then the same court decided what the vindication was worth in money, and the answer emptied the victory of most of its meaning. Deringer had sued for $15,000. By the reported figures, the damages actually awarded came to somewhere around $1,700, roughly a tenth of what he had asked. The court arrived at the smaller number by tying the award to a defensible estimate of the profits Deringer could show he had actually lost, rather than to the larger, harder-to-prove injury to his name and market that the full claim represented. The reasoning was sound as law. As justice for the man, it was a rounding error. Consider what $1,700 represented against the scale of the harm. Plate, by the accounts, had sold something on the order of 2,000 or more counterfeit pistols, at a pace of 400 a month, over a sustained period, into the richest pocket pistol market in the country. The genuine shop's entire lifetime output was around 15,000 guns. The damage to the name, spread across every Western buyer who now believed a cheap copy was what a Deringer amounted to, was incalculable and permanent. And the law's answer, the number that was supposed to make it right, was the price of roughly 110 pistols. He had won the argument and lost almost everything the argument was about. That was the smaller cruelty. The larger one was structural, and it is the payoff of the letter planted 2 chapters ago. The lawsuit could punish a specific man for specific sales. What it could not do was give Deringer ownership of the name itself, because he had never held that ownership and the case did not confer it. And so the counterfeiters, watching the outcome, learned exactly the lesson the outcome taught. The problem was never the copying of the gun. The problem, legally, was the use of a living man's name to sell it. Solve that, and the whole enterprise became not merely tolerable but bulletproof. The solution they arrived at is almost too neat to believe, and it is documented. If the danger was using Henry Deringer's name without his leave, then the answer was to find a different man who genuinely bore the name and use his. By the reported accounts, that is what happened. A man named Deringer, spelled in the way the forgers preferred, described as a Philadelphia tailor, was brought into the arrangement so that guns could be stamped with a real person's real name. Now, the pistols were not forgeries of Henry Deringer at all. They were the honest products of a man actually named Deringer, who had every right in the world to put his own name on his own goods. And if that name happened to be worth a fortune because of a different man's life's work, the law had nothing to say about it. Read the maneuver slowly, because it is the exact moment the name left Henry Deringer's hands for good. His own lawsuit had established that no one could sell copies under his name. The rival's answer was to acquire a legal right to a name spelled almost identically and sell copies under that. The victory Deringer had won was the thing that taught them how to make the theft permanent and lawful. He had gone to court to protect his name, and the direct consequence of going to court was a legally armored version of the same name, spelled with the counterfeiter's extra R that he could never touch. The verdict did not free him, it freed them, and the timing sharpened every edge of it. All of this, the flood of copies, the betrayal by his agent, the lawsuit, the hollow award, the workaround that legitimized the stolen spelling, was happening in the early 1860s, when Henry Deringer was a man in his mid-70s. He had built the most sought-after pocket pistol in America. He had watched it be taken from him piece by piece. The design copied, the name lifted, the market flooded, the distribution turned against him, the courtroom victory converted into his enemy's license. He was old. He was still wealthy from a long and careful life, and he was losing the one thing that would have carried his name past his death, precisely as his death came into view. He did not know the worst was still ahead. He did not know that within 2 years, a man would walk into a theater in Washington with one of his pistols in his pocket, would use it to commit the most famous murder in the history of the Republic, and would, in doing so, blow Henry Deringer's name across every front page in the nation, in the spelling his counterfeiters had invented, and make the theft not just permanent, but immortal. Chapter 10. April 14th, 1865. On the evening of the 14th of April, 1865, 5 days after the surrender at Appomattox that effectively ended the Civil War, John Wilkes Booth entered Ford's Theater in Washington carrying a single-shot pocket pistol made by Henry Deringer of Philadelphia. Its caliber is generally given as .44, a large ball for so small a gun. It held 1 round. Booth would need exactly 1. The choice of weapon was not incidental, and understanding why he chose it returns the story to the entire design logic of the object. Booth's problem was the problem the Deringer pistol had been built, across 2 decades, to solve. He needed to get a weapon into a guarded public place, close to a guarded man, without being detected, and he needed it to work at the distance of a step. A long gun was unthinkable. A large revolver was bulky and conspicuous. What he needed was a gun he could carry invisibly that would deliver a decisive ball at arm's length from a single certain shot. He needed the gun already on the body rather than the gun left behind. He chose the Deringer for precisely the reasons a gambler on a Mississippi steamboat chose one. It was small enough to hide and serious enough to kill. At close to 10:15 in the evening, during the 3rd act of the play, Booth entered the presidential box, raised the little pistol behind the president's head, and fired the single round into it. The gun did the one thing it was designed to do, once, the way it had been designed to do it. Abraham Lincoln never regained consciousness and died the following morning. The most consequential shot in American political history was fired from a pocket pistol built by a Philadelphia craftsman who was, at that moment, an 80-year-old man with 2 years left to live. The physical afterlife of the gun is a matter of record. In the chaos, the pistol was left behind in the box, and it was found there on the floor by a theater patron named William T. Kent. It passed into the hands of the authorities and became evidence in the trial of the conspirators that ran through the spring and early summer of 1865. From there, it entered the custody of the War Department, and it survives to this day, a small, dark, entirely ordinary-looking object that happens to be one of the most historically freighted artifacts in the United States. Engraved on it, the mark of its maker, the name Deringer, 1R, on the gun that killed the president. The details of Booth's use of it read, in retrospect, like a demonstration of the product's design brief carried to its ultimate conclusion. Booth was not a soldier, and this was not a soldier's task. It was an ambush of one man at conversational distance, and it required a weapon that could be carried into a public theater, past other people, without drawing a glance, and then produced and fired at the range of a step. That is the muff pistol problem, the gambler's problem, the problem the Deringer had been refined across 20 years to solve, transposed onto the killing of a head of state. Booth reached the box, waited for a line in the play he knew would draw a laugh loud enough to cover the report, stepped behind the president, and fired the single ball. The concealment worked. The one shot was enough. The gun performed its function to specification, and its function, stripped of everything else, was to let one person kill another at close range from a weapon nobody saw coming. There is a further, quieter irony in which weapon did the deed and which did not. Booth carried more than the pistol that night. When he leapt to the stage and fled, and in the days of pursuit that followed, he was armed also with a large knife, and his co-conspirators used other weapons in the coordinated attacks of that evening. But it was the little single-shot pocket pistol, the concealable one, the one built for exactly this kind of intimate, sudden violence, that did the thing history remembers. Of all the arms in play that night, the one that entered the language was the Deringer, because the Deringer was the one whose entire reason for existing was the killing of a man at the length of an arm. But the gun is not where the name went. The name went into the newspapers, and that is where this chapter pays off the letter planted long before it. In April of 1865, the story of Lincoln's murder was the largest news event the country had ever experienced, and every paper in the nation reported it, and reported the weapon. The weapon was a Deringer pistol. But the papers, working at speed, working from the common spelling that the counterfeiters had spent a decade forcing into circulation, printed the name again and again in the form the market had learned. They printed it, very often, as Deringer, with 2 R's. The spelling the forgers had invented to steal the name legally was the spelling the nation now read, 100,000 times over, attached to the most famous killing in its history. Consider the mechanism of what happened in those weeks, because it is the moment a name became a word. Before the assassination, Deringer was already a genericized term in the loose way of the market, the name people asked for when they wanted a pocket pistol, more recognizable, some said, than Colt's own name was for the revolver. The assassination took that regional, commercial genericization and detonated it into the national language, permanently, in a single spring. Everyone now knew what a Deringer was. It was the kind of gun that had killed Lincoln. And the spelling everyone now knew, the spelling that entered the culture welded to the event, was the counterfeiter's spelling, the 2R forgery, not the 1R name of the man who had made the actual gun. The reframe is almost unbearable in its precision. The event that made Henry Deringer's name immortal was an event he had nothing to do with, that he could not have prevented, that he surely regarded with horror, and it made immortal not his name, but the stolen version of it. His single greatest moment of fame arrived in the wrong spelling, describing a murder, in a form invented by the men who had robbed him. He got the immortality, and his counterfeiters got the trademark. A gun that fires once had fired the shot that would echo forever, and the echo carried the forger's word, not the maker's name. There is a further cruelty in how a name that means a gun becomes fixed by the worst possible use of that gun. Before April of 1865, the word Deringer, however it was spelled, carried mixed and ordinary associations. The gambler's edge, the traveler's insurance, the small, elegant object a person of means might own. The assassination overwrote all of that with a single meaning and burned it in. From that spring forward, the first thing the word summoned in the national mind was not a card table or a coat pocket. It was a murdered president slumped in a theater box. Deringer's name, in its stolen spelling, was welded permanently to the most reviled act in the country's political history, and there was no lawsuit, no craftsmanship, no amount of quality that could unweld it. The counterfeiters had taken his name. The assassin had defined what it would mean forever. And the man himself, the actual Henry Deringer of Philadelphia, had no say in either theft. He was still alive to read it. And he still had almost nothing he could do about it, because a man cannot sue a language. Chapter 11. The word goes public. After April of 1865, the market for pocket pistols did something that would have looked like triumph to anyone who did not understand whose triumph it was. It exploded. The most famous handgun in America was suddenly the little concealable pistol, and demand surged, and every maker in the country with the capacity to build one rushed to meet it. The category boomed. And the boom went almost entirely to men who were not named Henry Deringer. The clearest example is Remington, a large and capable arms manufacturer with the industrial capacity Deringer's handshop had never possessed. Beginning in 1866, the year after the assassination and the year Deringer's own life was near its end, Remington put into production a small over-under pocket pistol, 2 barrels, stacked one atop the other, chambered for a .41 rimfire cartridge. They called it, in the language the culture now used without thinking, a Deringer. The Remington Double Deringer, with two R's, was manufactured from 1866 until 1935, a run of nearly 70 years, and across that run the company produced more than 150,000 of them. Remington was not alone, and the roster of who piled into the category tells the story of how completely the word had come loose from the man. Colt, the great rival whose whole business had been repetition, moved into the little single-shot pocket guns too, acquiring the National Arms Company in 1870 to get its metallic cartridge Deringer designs, and then producing its own models under the generic name, one of them refined by an employee named Thur and kept in production into the early 20th century. There was even a cartridge that told the tale by itself, the 41 rimfire, sometimes called the 41 short. A round designed from the ground up specifically to feed these pocket pistols, an entire ammunition standard built around a category that had grown far larger than any one maker. Sharps built a four-barreled version. Others built their own. The word Deringer was now a shelf in the store, a type of thing that many companies made, and the companies making it were large, industrial, cartridge-firing operations that had nothing to do with the hand-built percussion pistol or the Philadelphia craftsman whose name they were all, without paying him or crediting him or in most cases even thinking of him, using. Set that single product's numbers against the original. Set that single product's numbers against the original. Henry Deringer's genuine shop, across the entire life of the real Philadelphia pistol, made something like 15,000 guns. One competitor's single model, riding the word Deringer's own gun had made famous, made more than 10 times that many, and did it under the spelling the counterfeiters had chosen, and did it entirely lawfully, because by now, Deringer was not a name at all. It was a common noun. It was a category of object, like a revolver or a musket, and no one owned it, and anyone could make one and call it what everyone already called it. This is the moment the genericization completed itself, and it is worth being precise about what genericization actually costs, because it is a strange kind of loss that looks from the outside like the ultimate success. When a brand name becomes the generic word for its whole category, when a maker's name becomes the name of the thing itself, the usual story is that this is the summit of marketing, the dream, the proof of total dominance. And in the moment of reaching it, it is. But there is a trap door at the summit, and the trap door is this. The instant a maker's name becomes the generic word, it stops being his property and becomes everyone's. The value he spent a lifetime building into the name flows outward, to every competitor who can now use it freely, and away from him, the one man who can no longer claim it as his own. The name enriches the entire category, and specifically impoverishes its origin. Deringer had reached the summit and fallen through the trap door, and the fall was total. His name meant a pocket pistol so completely that his name no longer meant him. Every rival stamping Deringer on a gun was making money from the reputation he had built, and none of that money reached him, and the law, which had just been in the process of inventing the very protections that might have mattered, had arrived a generation too late for the man who had helped invent them in a California courtroom. The word was public. It would stay public. It is public today, sitting in every dictionary, lowercase, defined as a small pocket pistol, with no mention of the man, spelled the way the forgers spelled it. He had a little time left to watch it happen. Not much. The boom that carried his name into permanence as a common word was cresting in the exact years his own life was ending, and the contrast between the two trajectories, the word ascending into the language and the man descending toward his grave, is the whole shape of the tragedy compressed into a span of about 3 years. He died with the word at the height of its fame, and himself at the end of his life, wealthy by every conventional measure and dispossessed of the only asset that would have carried any of it forward. Chapter 12. A wealthy man who owned nothing. Henry Deringer died on the 28th of February, 1868, in Philadelphia, at the age of 81. He died rich. This is the fact that has to be held against everything else in this chapter, because it complicates the easy reading of the story and makes the actual lesson sharper than a simple tale of ruin would allow. The man was not destroyed. He was, by the ordinary measures of a 19th century life, a success to the very end. The record of his estate makes the point. He had owned, across his life, several pieces of real estate in the Philadelphia region. He held coal mining tracts in Luzerne County, in the anthracite country of northeastern Pennsylvania, a serious and forward-looking investment in the industrial fuel of the age. He had been, in the language of the period, a well-to-do man, a substantial citizen of a substantial city. When he died, his obituary in the Evening Bulletin described him as one of the oldest, most influential, and most respected of Philadelphia's native citizens. That is not the epitaph of a man the world had beaten. It is the epitaph of a pillar. Notice, too, what kind of wealth he had accumulated, because it reveals how he thought. Land and coal tracts are hard assets. They are things a man can hold, deed, fence, and leave to a child. They are the investments of a careful, conservative man who trusts what he can stand on and put a boundary around. That instinct served him well everywhere it could be applied, and it is precisely the instinct that failed him on the one asset it could not touch, because a name is not a thing a man can fence. Deringer secured every part of his fortune that could be secured by ownership of a physical thing, and left unsecured the one part of his fortune that was not a physical thing at all, and that unsecured part turned out to be the largest and most enduring by far. He guarded the coal and lost the name, and the name was worth more than the coal. So the lesson here is not that Henry Deringer failed. He did not fail. He accumulated real wealth, held real property, earned real standing, and died at a great age in comfort and honor. The lesson is stranger and more useful than failure would have been, and it is this. Personal wealth and enterprise value are not the same thing, and a man can win completely at the first while losing completely at the second, and the second is the one that outlives him. Deringer had converted his life's work into the things a prudent man converts it into: land, coal, real estate, a good name among his neighbors. Those are excellent things, and they are also, every one of them, things that stop at the edge of a single life or scatter among heirs. What he had not managed to convert his work into was the one asset that could have compounded past his death and carried the whole enterprise forward as an institution. He had not secured the name, and the name was the only part of what he had built that the world actually wanted, the only part with the power to become something larger than one man's lifetime. He had banked everything except the thing worth banking. Look at the two ledgers side by side, because the gap between them is the entire point. On the personal ledger, Henry Deringer is a wealthy, respected, successful man who dies full of years. On the enterprise ledger, Henry Deringer is a man who built the most valuable brand name in the American gun trade and owned no piece of it at his death, whose name was at that moment being printed 100,000 times a year to sell other men's guns, and who could not pass a single dollar of that value to a single heir because he had never been able to make the value his to pass. The richer the word became, the poorer the estate looked by comparison, because the word had been the real fortune all along, and the word belonged to everyone else. His heirs understood the shop, not the lesson, and it showed in the years that followed. The family continued making guns for a time after his death, keeping the physical enterprise going in the ordinary way that families continue a trade. But a shop is not a brand, and a brand a family does not own is not an inheritance. The making of Deringer pistols by Deringers dwindled and, in time, stopped. The company, the actual firm that Henry Deringer had run in Northern Liberties for the better part of 6 decades, faded and ended. The workshops themselves, in that quarter of Philadelphia, were in time paved over or pulled down, until there was nothing on the ground to mark where the most famous pocket pistol in the world had been made by hand. The company died. The word did not. And the gap between those two sentences is the whole story, because it means that everything anyone would remember about Henry Deringer was going to be carried, from then on, not by the enterprise he had built and owned, which was gone, but by the word he had built and lost, which was everywhere. The name would outlive the company by more than a century and a half. It would just do it without belonging to anyone at all. Chapter 13. Morbid or weak-minded. There are 2 objects that carry Henry Deringer's name into the present, and neither of them is a company, because the company is gone. One is a single small pistol in a museum. The other is a word in a dictionary. Between them, they hold everything that survived of him, and the way each one behaves tells the final chapter of what he made and lost. The pistol first. The actual gun that Booth fired into Lincoln's head survived, as the record already showed, passing from the theater floor through the conspiracy trial into the custody of the War Department, and its later history is a quiet, revealing thing. For decades, the government simply held it, an object too significant to discard and too grim to display. In 1931, the question of showing it to the public came up, pressed forward through the involvement of Ulysses Grant III, a grandson of the general and himself an Army officer and official. The request to put the assassination pistol on display was refused. The reason given, preserved in the record, is one of the most telling sentences in the whole story. The gun, an official wrote, would have more of an appeal for the morbid or weak-minded than for the students of history. Sit with that judgment for a moment, because it is being made about the very object this story exists to examine. The keepers of the pistol believed that public fascination with it was a low impulse, a morbid one, unworthy of serious history, and for a decade they kept it out of sight on that reasoning. They were half right and entirely missing the point. The fascination is not morbid. Or rather, it is not only morbid. The gun is worth looking at not because it killed a president, though it did, but because it is the physical proof of a business paradox, the single object where the maker's fame and the maker's dispossession meet. It is the most famous product ever made by a man who did not own the fame. Eventually, the reasoning softened, and since 1942, the pistol has been on public display, and it sits today at Ford's Theater in Washington, small and dark behind glass, its maker's name engraved on it with one R, being read by people almost none of whom know that the spelling in their own heads has two. The word is the other survivor, and it behaves in the exact opposite way. The pistol is singular, fixed in one museum, precious precisely because there is only one of it. The word is everywhere, free, infinitely reproduced, precious to no one because it costs nothing and belongs to everyone. Open any dictionary of the English language and the word is there. Deringer. 2 R's. A noun, lowercase, defined as a short-barreled pocket pistol of large caliber. There is no capital letter to mark it as a name. There is no man in the definition. The word has been fully absorbed into the language as a common thing, the way genericized names always are, sitting on the shelf next to the other former names that became words, the ones people reach for without any idea that a person is buried inside them. The company of words that a Deringer keeps reveals exactly what happened to it. The language is full of former names that became ordinary nouns. Names that started as one person's or one company's property and were absorbed so completely that almost no one remembers there was ever an owner. People reach for these words without a flicker of awareness that a name is buried inside. A Deringer sits in that company now, lowercase and ownerless, and it got there by the same road all of them did, by becoming so successful that success dissolved the ownership. The difference in Deringer's case is only that his dissolution was helped along by forgers and welded into place by an assassination, so that the version of the name that survived was not even the one he spelled. Most men, whose names became words at least, kept the spelling. Deringer did not keep even that. That absorption is the final measure of both the achievement and the loss, and they are the same event seen from two sides. To have one's own name become an ordinary word in the language is a kind of immortality that almost no one achieves. It is also the complete erasure of the person, because the word only becomes ordinary by forgetting that it was ever anyone's name. The triumph and the erasure are not two things that happened to Henry Deringer. They are one thing. The word survived by ceasing to be him. And so the balance at the end stands like this. The company he built and owned is gone, paved over, ended within a generation of his death. The name he built and never owned is permanent, universal, and spelled by his enemies. The one physical gun that made the name explode is behind glass, called morbid, drawing crowds. He got everything a man could get except the thing he made, and the thing he made outlived all of it. Conclusion. Here is the whole story in one cold inventory. One gunmaker, the son of a gunmaker, who spent 30 years as a government subcontractor making muskets and treaty rifles no customer ever chose by name. One late pivot, at past 50, to a single small civilian pistol that fired one shot and hid in a palm. One perfect product for a market he never courted, found by a gold rush 2,000 miles away that made his name the name of the thing. One fatal omission, no patent and no trademark, in a country whose trademark law barely existed. One flood of counterfeits, many from his own former workmen, stamped with a name anyone could copy. One extra letter, an R added by forgers to steal the name lawfully. One betrayal, by his own San Francisco agent, selling 400 fakes a month. One lawsuit, won for principal and lost for value. $1,700 against a claim of $15,000, its only lasting result a legal path that let the theft continue under a real man's borrowed name. One assassination, that blew the stolen spelling across every front page in the nation. One competitor's single product, 150,000 guns, outproducing the original tenfold under the word the original had made famous. One wealthy, respected death in 1868, with land and coal and honor and not $1 of the name he had made. One company, gone within a generation. One word, everywhere, forever, spelled with 2 R's. The gap between that company and that word is where the entire business story lives, and it is a gap that has nothing to do with guns. Henry Deringer did almost everything right. He made a superb product. He built a reputation so strong it sold without advertising. He reached the summit that every enterprise dreams of, the summit where the customer wants the maker's name and considers it the name of the thing itself. And it destroyed the value of his work, permanently, because he had reached the summit without securing the one thing that turns a famous name into an owned asset. He had the reputation and none of the rights. State each of his decisions as the business problem it solved, and the pattern is clear. The government contracts solved the problem of survival and built a shop. The pocket pistol solved the problem of a vanishing market and built a fortune. The large caliber in a small frame solved the real customer's real problem, the gun that is actually on the body when the trouble comes. Every one of those was a good decision, well made, correctly aimed. And then state his one error as the decision it was, made once, by omission, and never corrected. He chose to protect the most valuable thing he owned, his name, with craftsmanship and reputation instead of law, in an age when the law was just barely coming into existence, and by the time the law arrived, the name was already gone. That single choice cost him everything the other choices had earned. Not in his lifetime, where he stayed rich, but in the only ledger that outlasts a lifetime, the one that decides what a name is worth after the man is dead. The name survived because it meant something exact. A small gun, large in the bore, that a person could carry hidden and fire once at the length of an arm. That precision is what made it worth stealing, and it was stolen by everyone, and it belongs today to no one. Sitting lowercase in the dictionary, spelled the way the thieves spelled it, describing a category of object that a Philadelphia craftsman defined so completely that the world took his name for the definition and left the man behind. If you want to understand how a brand can outlast the company that made it, and enrich everyone except the person whose name it carries, Henry Deringer is the case to study.